Hello! I'm Elaine, and I'm a tour guide in the French Quarter. I do ghost tours. And I am not going to tell you the stories that I tell on my tour, because you gotta pay for those. But if you want to hear some interesting things that have happened to me while I'm leading random drunk people around the French Quarter, I got you.
So I have had an eventful couple of weeks, but it's mostly been the kind of stuff that I walk away without a good story from. Like I had to call an ambulance for the first time for one of my guests on a tour, and yeah, it's not a good story. It was just pure chaos and stress and me freaking out while trying to keep the guests calm and also trying to get an ambulance there, and it's New Orleans, so that was taking a while. And on that note, I would like to thank Truly for coming up and offering to help me with my guests while I dealt with this. But not really a good story. All that really amounted from it was me getting a guest into an ambulance. But I also had one of the best tours I've ever had in the last couple of weeks. And hilariously, it started out with one of those events that you're like, oh, this is going to go poorly. Because somebody else was like basically dividing the guests and just handing them to me. And they handed me a group of 10 amongst my crew that were like, really obviously a bachelor party. All guys, all in their early 20s, all being like, woo! And I'm like, oh, this is going to go so badly. But it turns out what they were wooing was history. They were really into history. And throughout the entire night, they were perfectly quiet during all the stops that asked complex, in-depth, nuanced historical questions about the events. At one point, we were discussing Paganini and the history of demonic violin players. And I'm just sitting here like, oh my God, y'all are great. And also, I walked away from that tour with the best tips I've ever made as a tour guide. But to balance that out, the very next night, I had a tiny little group that were just what I call the TV face people, the ones that don't respond to anything. Like, both when I'm in the middle of stories, like I'm telling a joke, they're not laughing. I tell something horrific, they don't flinch. I tell something, depressing, they're not frowning. Just blank face the entire time. But also between stops, when I'm trying to make small talk to figure out, like, what kind of things they want to hear about New Orleans as we're walking around. They're giving me either one-word answers or just no answer whatsoever. Like, I think at one point I asked them how they were enjoying the city, and literally none of them responded. And I'm like, cool. That doesn't make my job hard in the least. But there is one event I had that I actually think is an okay story. So this was on the tour that I do that is talking a lot about sex workers and tends to be a drunk tour because, yes, we visit 3 bars on this tour, which means that, yes, in my experience, and I haven't done this one too much yet, but in my experience, there are usually at least a couple people who are getting on the verge of too drunk for this tour by the end. And I was at, like, the second to last stop, and I was talking about one of the madams, and there is a joke that's in the script, and, like, the scripts, inevitably, the more I do them, the more they come my own, the more I, change the jokes, move in different jokes, do different things. And this joke is one that came written into the script. And I read it and went, oh, I'm probably not going to do that joke for long because that is such not a me kind of joke. But until I fill out the story a little bit more, I'm keeping it. And also, I will admit, I've sort of grown attached to the joke. But we're talking about this madam who was famous for knowing everything about the Johns that came to her brothel. And I'm listing like, oh, if you had a mole, she knew about it. If you had a scar, she knew about it. If you had a kink, she knew about it. And the joke is you then end it with like, and if you had a nickname for your penis, she would know about it. And I made that joke, and one of my guests, who was noticeably a bit too drunk, turns to her husband and, loud as I am, says, oh, like you call yours little, and filled in what I'm assuming is his nickname for his penis. And everyone burst out laughing. Like, it was one of those moments that was just, like, hard to contain because all the guests were, like, roaring with laughter. But the problem is, the one person who wasn't laughing was the guy who just had his penis's nickname outed to an entire group of people, most of whom were his friends, but a couple of whom were absolute strangers. And he turned beet red and was glaring, and because he was visibly angry, I did not laugh along with the group, and I tried to just keep the story rolling to prevent, any chaos. But yeah, for the rest of the night, they stood next to each other, the couple, and their hands were holding each other, but they were also leaning far apart from each other. I'm like, oh, that is the visual signal of we are fighting later tonight. But yeah, to make it even better, I get back to the storefront and I'm talking to the boss, and she's like, yeah, no, that happens at least once every 2 or 3 months. Good news is, most guys just roll with it and find it funny themselves, but every now and then, yeah, you get that guy who's really upsetty spaghetti. So yeah, it's been a fun couple of weeks. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and be sure to check out my book, Drunks of the French Quarter Theater, available on Amazon, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, pretty much wherever.